Two big breaking headlines from President Trump. First, he says he plans to negotiate with Iran's new leadership following the death of its supreme leader. And two, Iran was 2 weeks away from a nuclear weapon. Joining me now is Democratic Senator from Delaware, Chris Coons. He serves on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, welcome. Glad to have you here. Those two questions. First, the idea that he plans to speak with new Iranian leadership. Wasn't regime change his goal?
Well, look, what he seems to be pursuing in Iran is closer to what he pursued in Venezuela, which was simply replacing the top leader of the regime and then negotiating for an oil deal or a minerals deal with what's left of a repressive authoritarian regime. That's not what the people of Venezuela were hoping for when he met with Maria Machado, who actually won the Nobel Peace Prize, the leader of the opposition from Venezuela. She was hoping that he would be pressing for elections for a return to democracy. That's not what's been happening in Venezuela. And obviously, the people of Iran who came into the streets by the tens of thousands earlier this year and were encouraged to do so by Trump and were killed by the thousands by the brutal regime of the Ayatollah, they were hoping for regime change. I do think it's a positive if he's willing to begin negotiations. But frankly, I think we need to hear as a country from our president. He hasn't addressed us about this war in 36 hours, and posting a video to Truth Social, in my view, just doesn't cut it, especially now that we have American casualties in this new war in the Middle East.
But, Senator, what if a further hardliner is brought into power in the wake of these attacks? Then what?
That's one of the real dangers that I've been citing since Trump launched this war of choice, is that we don't have a clear path or strategy for how to achieve a positive regime change in Iran. Look, last week in President Trump's State of the Union address to Congress and the country, he spent just 3 minutes out of 2 hours on Iran. And I was in the chamber. I couldn't tell what his goals really are. Are they to defend and support protesters? Is it to make it impossible for Iran to ever have a nuclear weapon? Was it to degrade their ballistic missile capability? Was it to fight against their support for terrorism in the region? Those are different means that require different ends with a different scope. And to the second issue you just raised, that President Trump claims they were 2 weeks from a nuclear weapon, I've never seen any intelligence to suggest that. Is it possible that they were 2 weeks from having enough fissile material to assemble the material for a weapon? Yes. But in the strike last year, led by President Trump and our military in partnership with the Israelis, he claimed that they obliterated Iran's nuclear enrichment and weapons program. And what I've seen is evidence that their ability to actually assemble and deliver a nuclear weapon was still a long way away, and in no small part due to the success of last year's strike.
And, Senator, I will say you are very much echoing the sentiments of Joe Cirincione, with whom I spoke in this last hour. He said the very same thing about the ability to have an actual implementable nuclear weapon months and months away from for the number of processes that would have to take place. Again, fissile material, perhaps for 2 weeks from now. That is not anything close to having a nuclear weapon like that. Let's get to, tragically, those 3 U.S. service members who were killed in action as part of the military operation. We have 5 also seriously wounded. In a statement yesterday, sir, you called this a reckless new war of choice. Do you believe this administration, prior to going in, properly weighed the risks and strategy of such a massive military operation? Is there any evidence of that?
No, and part of how a democracy should go to war is that the president and his senior national security advisors should have to make the case to the American people and to Congress. That's why the Constitution gives Congress, in the Article 1 provision of the Constitution, the power to decide whether or not to go to war. Look, for months and months before the war was launched against Iraq under the administration of George W. Bush, his Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor went and briefed Congress. Congress debated. Congress voted on an authorization for the use of military force. We should be doing the same here. President Trump hasn't made that case. And part of what he's doing now in claiming mistakenly that Iran was that close to a nuclear weapon is trying to find the justification for why there was an imminent threat that required him to act without any explanation to the American people or a vote by Congress. At the end of the day, what matters here is that President Trump ran for president on lowering people's costs, making America healthy again, and no new wars of regime change. This is a war directed at regime change. My hope is that it will not expand and become more dangerous and more deadly and cost the lives of more American service members, diplomats, civilians, and people throughout the region. But in the absence of any clear strategy and with the absence of congressional support, President Trump is the one who's responsible for launching this war. And if it goes badly, President Trump's the one that folks should hold to account, because he ran for president saying he wasn't going to start wars like this.
Senator, very quickly, what are your fears about an expansion of this war, and how would that happen?
Well, the Iranian regime, look, let's first be clear. This is a brutal terrorist regime that has blood on its hands, from killing its own civilian citizens, from massacring folks throughout the region, from killing American service members in Saudi Arabia, in Lebanon, in Iraq. So I do not mourn for a minute the passing of the Ayatollah Khamenei and the leaders of the IRGC. But given that this regime has its back to the wall, they're going to use every tool they have. Missiles and drones, yes. Attacks against civilian targets throughout the Gulf and the world, yes. But also cyber attacks and terrorist attacks. And at a time when we've had our national security resources deflected to immigration enforcement and away from cybersecurity and national security enforcement, I'm concerned that they will activate sleeper cells in the United States, that they will carry out cyber attacks, and we've already seen them carry out attacks on so-called soft targets or civilian targets throughout the Middle East. This is the holy month of Ramadan, and one big mistake I think the Iranians have made is to attack civilian targets in Oman, in UAE, in Saudi Arabia, and thus to have no shot at getting sympathy from the Muslim world as they are attacking civilian targets throughout their region.
Senator Chris Coons from Delaware, thank you, sir, for your time and insights. Much appreciated.